Good. Right. Saya biasa Clarice saya akan relax dulu. Saya baca doa dulu, izin ya. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Ya, alhamdulillah. Okey. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good evening. Salam sejahtera, salam kasih dan salam belas buat semua yang sedang mengikuti siaran ini. Selamat datang ke MGTF KUAT siri nombor 3. Nama saya Hasnul Jamal bin Saidun. Saya akan menjadi moderator untuk siaran pada hari ini. Sebelum itu saya minta kita semua pasang kita punya niat. Hari ini kita nak enjoy belajar dan kita berdoa agar kita dapat memanfaatkan ilmu yang kita akan terima daripada Galeri Sandi pada hari ini untuk kesejahteraan semua manusia, InsyaAllah. Okay. So saya ambil sedikit masa untuk terangkan tentang KUAT. KUAT adalah singkatan untuk kuliah atas talian atau online lecture. But it's not necessarily just lecture. It can be anything. It can be workshop. It can be very interactive thing. Ianya dianjurkan oleh Muzium dan Galeri Tuanku Fauziah, Universiti Sains Malaysia, MGTF, USM. So ini adalah siri nombor 3, susulan kepada siri nombor 1 dan nombor 2 yang sebelum ini disampaikan oleh saudara Nasir Baharudin dan kemudiannya oleh Aloysius Yap. So hari ini siri nombor 3. So siri ini merupakan sebahagian daripada usaha berterusan MGTF USM untuk menyediakan satu ruang perkongsian ilmu, khususnya ilmu yang dibina daripada kerja penyelidikan yang dibuat dengan begitu passionate sekali oleh orang tertentu. Juga yang ilmu yang terbina daripada kerja kreatif, kerja pengkaryaan, dan ilmu yang terbina daripada inisiatif yang dilakukan secara amali, secara perbuatan yang terkait dengan whatever that relates to kesejahteraan manusia lah, kesejahteraan komuniti. Saya perlu kongsi sedikit, KUAT ini terasnya adalah penyuburan antara bidang sains dan bidang seni, iaitu kita nak menyuburkan kedua-dua bidang sains dan seni itu secara seimbang dalam pendekatan kita terhadap ilmu. Bagi tak adalah sengit kiri dan sengit kanan sahaja. Terutama sekali dalam kita mendepani banyaklah cabaran yang kita hadapi pada masa kini dan pada masa akan datang. Bukan saja tahun depan, tetapi 10, 20, 30, 40 hingga 50 tahun akan datang. Dan kita bukan saja nak berteori, kita kalau boleh, kita mahu juga berkongsi sesuatu yang boleh membawa solution, boleh membawa mengusulkan ataupun boleh mengusulkan satu penyelesaian yang lebih lestari terhadap apa saja isu dan masalah yang kita depani pada hari inilah ya. So untuk MGTF KUAT siri 3 ini kita akan menampilkan seorang lagi tetamu istimewa. Hari ini kita ada Dr. Clarissa Lee. Saya kenal dia baru. Saya terangkan sedikit ya, Clarice ya. Saya jumpa dia sewaktu kami menjadi hakim untuk pertandingan anugerah Artscience Award. Kemudian dia jemput saya untuk mengulas buku dia. Ya. Dia tu dia akan kongsikan kandungan buku dia. Ya. So Dr. Clarissa Lee ini adalah seorang pensyarah kanan di Fakulti Seni Kreatif Universiti Malaysia dan dia mengajar di Jabatan Drama. Bidang-bidang penyelidikan beliau ni antaranya of course lah Artscience ya, seni sains, juga Speculative Design and also Science and Speculative Fiction. So dia science fiction punya nerd lah, dia kata begitu ya, Clarice ya. Saya science fiction juga tapi saya suka beli watak-watak atau toys, science fiction toys ya. Anyway, itu saya lah. Okay. Clarice ni, beliau sekarang ni sedang mengusahakan untuk menyiapkan sebuah buku tentang sejarah sains fizikal di Malaysia dan Singapura. Sambil itu dia juga sedang membentuk satu lagi buku tentang sejarah dan falsafah Artscience atau seni sains dari perspektif Asia Tenggara dengan penumpuan yang khusus terhadap Nusantara. Itu menarik tu. Saya pun look forward nak baca, tak sabar nak tahu. Kalau ada apa-apa yang teaser yang boleh di-share, tolong share. Dr. Clarissa juga menulis dalam blog di modularcriticism.blogspot.com. Okey, kuliah yang akan disampaikan oleh beliau berjudul Artscience, a Speculative Art Practice and Research Creation. Dalam bahasa Malaysianya, seni sains sebagai amalan seni spekulatif dan penghasilan penyelidikan. Kuliah ini akan disampaikan dalam bahasa Inggeris, tetapi perbincangan susulannya akan dilakukan dalam bahasa Inggeris dan dalam kuliah ini beliau akan menumpukan perhatian terhadap amalan-amalan Artscience yang menjadi sumber untuk penghasilan buku beliau yang telah pun baru-baru ini diterbitkan berjudul Artscience, A Curious Education. Beliau akan menyentuh tentang amalan-amalan seni dan seni sains. Kita tidak sebut seni dan sains ya, istilahnya seni sains, Artscience. Satu istilah. Amalan-amalan seni sains dari segi genealoginya yang merentas pelbagai tradisi dan geografi. Pada waktu yang sama, beliau juga akan berbicara tentang satu bentuk kesedaran yang semakin menumbuh tentang apakah yang dikatakan sebagai asas ataupun warisan seni sains itu, terutama sekali di wilayah-wilayah Asia Tenggara. Wilayah-wilayah Asia Tenggara ini mempunyai asas dan warisan Artscience-nya juga, walaupun pada waktu yang sama sedang bergelut dengan tekanan-tekanan modernisasi dan apa yang disebutkan sebagai pembangunan ataupun development itu. Okay. So, usaha untuk menemukan semula kesedaran seni sains ini juga sebenarnya semakin bertapak dengan membiak dengan giat di sebelah barat. Itu ironinya kan. Padahal pewarisan itu, seni sains itu juga sudah ada di wilayah Nusantara, tetapi di barat itu dia pick up dengan lebih hebat. So, Clarissa ni beliau menganggap bahawa praktis beliau sendiri adalah sebagai seorang penyelidik yang fokus kepada reka bentuk ya. Orang panggil design fokus ya. Yang menggunakan reka bentuk spekulatif atau speculative design sebagai amalan penyelidikan kreatif. Jadi reka bentuk spekulatif ini juga boleh dijadikan asas, telah digunakan sebagai asas untuk beberapa bentuk latihan yang beliau terbitkan dalam buku dia. So, Alhamdulillah. Sidang penonton semua, saya dengan segala hormatnya mempersilakan Dr. Clarissa Lee untuk menyampaikan beliau. Silakan.
Okay. Saya baru belajar unmute. Kalau nak unmute masa share screen, kena unmute ke atas, bukan bawah. Okay. Thank you very much, Prof. Hasno. And saya minta izin untuk menyampaikan my presentation dalam bahasa Inggeris sebab saya tahu ada ramai yang hadir di sini dan saya tak pasti jika ada juga antara mereka sini yang mungkin tak begitu fasih bahasa Melayu. At the same time, saya juga dah prepare dalam bahasa Inggeris. Tapi in terms of question and as well as in responses that you may have, because this is an interactive activity, kalau nak cakap dalam bahasa Melayu pun dibenarkan. And kalau ada sesiapa di sini yang tidak faham, anyone here who doesn't understand Malay, please let us know in the chat so that we can translate what is being said or done. Okay, thank you very much. So, okay, I'm sorry if I'm a little bit clumsy here because I have never used WebEx to give a talk before. So I use Zoom, I use Teams, but this is my first time using WebEx, so a lot of back and forth. So just to break down what I'm going to do today. So this is not a traditional conventional talk in the sense that I am not going to, basically just be lecturing in front of you and I expect you to listen and then do a Q&A at the end of it. Instead, there will be actually breaks throughout this talk, largely because this is not a theoretical talk. I will show you the link to the video of my more theoretical talk later on, which you can all go and take a look when you are free. But for this talk, it's actually more of a practice-based talk. So I'm actually showing some of the work that I'm developing from the exercises in the book. And do not worry that you have no idea how the book looks like or what's in it, because I will actually show you parts that are relevant. And even if you have no idea what's in the book, you will actually still be able to appreciate what I'm doing, because what is important is the sort of like the projects presented here, there. So in a way, it's basically me trying to hack the exercises in my own book. So one of my favorite tricks, as well as one of my practice as a researcher, and this actually was many years in development, actually stands for my also very, how would I put it, not very straightforward background. I actually started out in the sciences. I was trained in physics as an undergrad, and I thought I would actually stay on in that. But then I've always had an interest in the arts. So the good thing about when I was in undergrad, Universiti of Malaysia, is that Universiti of Malaysia in the late 90s and even the early part of this 21st century, which was when I was a student, at least in the science and arts faculty, they still practice a sort of liberal arts education mode. So you can actually take a lot of electives in other, from other departments or even other, well, they actually encourage you to go outside your faculty and take courses in other faculties as well, which is what I did. Initially, I thought I'll just stick to maybe science or maybe at least social science path and maybe go and take psychology, right? Because I'm always interested in what motivate people, what inspire people, and why people, do the things they do. But unfortunately, I couldn't get into that course. So I went on to take another thing which I've always been interested in, but didn't have a chance to study because during my time, maybe still the same now, is that, if you're in the sciences, you are pretty much cut off from access to a lot of arts and humanities subjects. Not that I think they are particularly interesting in schools from the way they were taught, but still it would have been good to have that as a background, and I actually went into literature. And I've always been interested in narratives, right? So for a long time, I thought narrative actually only works in terms of stories told through words, whether it's in oral storytelling form or in a written form. And that actually has been formative to my understanding of narrative form, I think, in my early days. As I said, I have no understanding of narrative when I went to university because, as I said, I was in the sciences and they don't actually teach you about narratives. And it's actually through taking a course in literature that I discovered that narrative does not just operate actually in the arts or even in the humanities, but it actually operates as well in the sciences. It's just that I was not told or I was not shown how those narratives are formulated. It was not present in the education that we receive as science students, not even at the university level. It's pretty much the process of shut up and calculate if you're a physics student. And for a lot of my friends who are in biology, they spend a lot of time memorizing, like lots of facts. But what do those memorization of facts translate to is something I think they never really were taught to reflect upon. And I think that probably also reflects the poverty of the kind of education that we receive, which I hear, I mean, there were attempts to change and rectify things. Now I'm a lecturer, I can see how things have changed since my time. But even then, it's very hard to change something that actually from the beginning, from the very basics, right? When you have been schooled into to be very rigid and very to be very rigid and also very narrow in your pursuits of education, your pursuits of knowledge. And even the skills taught to you kind of like forced you into kind of very narrow way. And I would say that when I was doing like classes in literature, and I actually ended up taking 3 classes in literature, and I also went on to take a class in drama. It was something I did randomly. I just want to look at a course book and say, let's try something I never thought I would do, and I decided to take a class in drama. Unfortunately, there was no acting involved, but it was still cool because, you know, I actually got to take a class with people in the performing arts, and I learned a little bit about that, and that was my introduction to it. And on top of that, I also decided to go and do something even crazier. And, you know, I went to AEI, which actually existed around that time. It was actually started around that time, and joined the European Studies class, right? Which was actually it's a form of interdisciplinarity, even though it's interdisciplinarity in the social sciences. Back then, they have a lot of money. Unfortunately, I can't say that's the case today. They had a lot of money, so they actually did a sort of like a program. It's the kind of program where it's almost as though you were actually going from one European country to the next, going from one university to the next. Because what they did was that they brought during alternate weeks, because the class meets once a week, if I remember correctly. And every week, they will bring in a guest lecturer. Usually they would only once or twice they will have somebody who's in-house speaking, but most weeks they will bring in a guest lecturer either from an ASEAN country or from a European country. And of course, they are mostly, as I say, in the social sciences. Humanities was not covered. Of course, neither was the sciences or the arts. So social sciences like in law, business studies, finance studies, political science. What else did we actually study? I mean, these were the 4 main areas that I remember most clearly. There were other stuff as well. And what was interesting for me was actually, even though, of course, I don't remember a lot of things about the topic, this, you know, I did very well on the course, but I don't remember a lot of things. But what I did actually learn from that, and that was a very new thing for someone like me who, you know, whose only experience of international education was probably like joining a summer school when I was a student, which is actually a local summer school in music, right? Where we get to do like master classes and workshops when I was a student. But that was as international as it get. We had someone who probably flew in and did stuff with us who was so-called international, but that was not really international in the sense of the word. And what was interesting for me at that point in time was not so much of the topic, but the style of teaching, and also the different narratives that were being developed by all these different professors from very different university, as well as intellectual cultures, right? Because intellectual cultures from, let's say, Thailand will be very different from intellectual cultures in Vienna. And even though it was not something that they explicitly convey to us, but it was very much present in the way they gave the lectures, also in these ideas that they chose to present, right? So and depending as well on disciplines, some probably are a lot more philosophical, some are more pragmatic, some are very technical. Like for instance, they were trying to teach me a lot about finance, and at that point in time, I didn't care as much about finance as I do today, because, you know, when you get older, you have to start caring about finance. But what was also interesting was also the different models that they introduced. And even though I was a science student, I had no idea what the hell was a model at that point in time, which even though I was studying a lot of like science models, I had no idea what those were. So it's when I was looking at that, there was this goose flock model that I saw, which basically has to do with foreign direct investments and all that. I don't remember what was the name of that model. That was my first introduction to model. And in finance, they actually use model as a way of trying to simulate sort of like conditions that may be as real as possible, but yet which are very ideal. And that is basically how science operates, especially in terms of laboratory sciences. And I won't even go into the theoretical sciences, which largely functions in models, but there are different kinds of models. There are more experimental models. There are also more mathematical models, and of course there are also those that kind of like sit in kind of in the middle. And then from there, as I went on to do a master's in English, and then I completed that. Took a few years to figure out where I want to do my PhD, if I still really want to do my PhD. At that point in time, I didn't know what does doing a PhD actually even mean, because I did not come from a very academic background in terms of family. I was basically first generation. Well, not true. I have uncles and aunts who went to university, but they went to university to do very practical fields, like economics and accounting, right? So there was no one to give you advice, especially when it comes to higher education. And at the point in time, I knew very much that I wanted to do something that was actually art science connected, except that I had no vocabulary. And in fact, the book that I eventually did here, and even though this is just the beginning of a series of other things I'm doing, in fact, I see it as an important step forward, because I've been planning this for a decade, and it was only realized last year because I was in between jobs, and I decided, I have time right now, and I have the space, and I don't have to worry about anything. Can't really go anywhere because of the MCO. So let's, take all these materials I've been collecting and writing and developing over a decade, actually more than a decade, but I would say probably it's went back a decade when I consciously started doing it. That was when I was in my very early days as a PhD student. So I started kind of like doing that for this book. And that itself was the beginning of my own journey, as well as my own inquiry into this kind of practice that I'm actually presenting to you today. And even when I went to my PhD, because I was also, as I say, very ignorant of what the PhD process was like, because I didn't really know people. I know some people who are already doing the PhD, but I have no clue about the process, and nobody actually told me what's expected. But one thing I did know was that I wanted to be a researcher, and I wanted to have a space to explore, to take risks, make mistakes, fail, try again, and then create something. Even in the failure, failure is not necessarily a bad thing. It's what you can actually build with it. I wanted a space that allows me to do that. And I know being out in the working world doesn't really allow it. Even today, I'm out in the working world, and there's the same problem I'm actually also facing, right? Even as a faculty member, as a lecturer. So, and I found my department by accident, largely because I was reading a book by someone who eventually became my mentor, and she's still my mentor today. Actually, she's actually quite famous, but I won't mention who she is. And she's been very supportive of my work, even though when I first met her, she was very intimidating, because as I say, she's very famous, and she's also very old. So which also kind of like, but very old, not in a way that make you feel sorry for her, but very old in the sense that she has that gravitas, that sort of like the sort of presence that can be intimidating if you like just want to go and not actually know why the hell you want to see her or why you want to even talk to her. So, and she actually was, I would say, my mentor in art science. And she wrote a book that was not really art science, but it was actually asking a lot of questions about the sciences that a lot of us who are trained as a scientist were never taught to us, which of course is the remit of the science education itself. So, and through the process, I was lucky to be in university. And of course, I know if a lot of you want to go to do a PhD through the normal sponsorship route from externals, you probably won't be able to do what I did, because I was lucky that I was given a fellowship, and I got a double scholarship and a fellowship from the US side of things, which actually relinquished me from a lot of burden as well as pressures. Like my colleagues, you go under I don't know, Ministry of Higher Education, all that, you know, you have very limited time. There are a lot of things you don't have time to do. They want you to come back immediately, and then they want you to publish in very specific like venues, something which I never had to deal with as a student, for good or bad. Maybe it's bad because it's got my career started a little bit later in the sort of formal way, but it was also good because I had more chance to explore. So I was able to go and connect with artists and scientists, which was I went to do my PhD at Duke University, and I didn't know. I mean, I knew there were some terrific people there, but I didn't realize how much they were into interdisciplinary collaboration until I actually got there. So I thought that was a very lucky thing on my part because I never expected that. And I wasn't even keen on going to Ivy Leagues, like places like like Harvard and all that didn't interest me because I presume, and I'm actually pretty right in presuming now that I know what goes on in there, is that they tend to be very traditionalist and very conventional, and they are not usually very supportive or trying to do work that I consider as, I don't like to use this word, but disruptive, or something that kind of goes against the grain of the status quo in terms of disciplines, right? They like you to do well, but they want you to do well in the discipline rather than go out of the discipline too much. So, and when I was there, I actually got introduced by accident. I think because it's like if you're in university, they put you on mailing lists, right? So I was suddenly on many mailing lists. Some, of course, I went and subscribed myself because I just have this FOMO, the fear of missing out. I want to make sure I know everything that's going on because I thought it's a chance of a lifetime. I'm actually abroad in a university where all the greatest and most exciting research and practices and work was taking place, and I want to make sure I'm in everything. Of course, it get a little exhausting. It's a good thing that it was actually in a small town, so at least it's not a busy city. If I was in New York, I probably would have have a mental breakdown from the constant activity. But at least the outside area was very idyllic and very relaxing. But the university itself was like a pressure cooker because there's just so many things happening at once. And I got introduced to the Brain Science Institute, and that was the first time I discovered that, for instance, neuroscientists, neuropsychiatrists, cognitive scientists, romance professors. When I say romance professors, they're basically romance studies professors. They are usually specialists in romance literature and languages, which is basically like Spain, France, Italy, the romance countries, so to speak, and art history, as well as there was actually a bunch of different programs. I think even the Middle East studies, but I'm not sure if they were there as well. But they were like sociology. So there was all these different people from all this, not just different disciplines, but even different fields within disciplines coming together trying to do brain science. And it was actually intriguing to me, like how the hell do you even do something like that? I mean, what does a literature professor has anything to say to a neuroscientist? Because at the point in time, I was so new to all these things. And a lot of the stuff that actually came up in my book and also inspired the work I'm going to show you here actually came from my time there, from actually looking at what other people were doing, being inspired by them. And, basically, I think that was the time when I finally broke out of my shell. And, before that, I put a lot of limitations on myself, thinking, I can't do this, I can't do that. It's too hard. There's no support, there's nothing. But I was amazed to find that there were people there who didn't let any kind of constraints or limitations kind of stop them from doing this. They were very entrepreneurial, and I don't mean entrepreneurial, which is used in Malaysian terms as someone who goes out and tries to start a business, right? That's the usual way in which entrepreneurship is associated in Malaysia, but no one has ever considered entrepreneurship in the sort of like in science, in the sort of like an artistic context, which basically means that you actually use that same kind of spirit, right? The spirit of risk-taking, of testing out ideas, brainstorming. I mean, a lot of things that people associate with, developing a startup actually operates in slightly different ways, but still operates as well in the arts. And I see that actually happening among my colleagues, because when I was there, because I was probably during my batch in the humanities, I was the only Malaysian. Actually, for all my 6.5 years there, I was the only Malaysian in humanities. I had some Malaysians I knew, but they were in the social sciences, like political science and psychology, but no one in the humanities. And actually, probably the only Southeast Asian they were like Southeast Asian, but they're American Southeast Asian, so it's a little bit different. So I was the only Southeast Asian as well, representing the humanities. So I realized I have to go out and make allies and make friends. And the good thing is they were people who were not just from from the US or from North America, but they were people who came from different parts of the world, especially the artists. And in the humanities, there's also where the arts program is located. They don't have an arts program in the sense like an art practice program that is big like an art school, but they have an arts program, like a fine arts, visual arts program, where you're trained in two things, which is making and doing, and thinking. And then in thinking, will bring to conceptualization. And it's actually very very normal actually over there, probably not here, where you'll be doing stuff where you are making things and you're theorizing what you are making. So you're basically becoming a sort of like a philosopher doer. So you make things and you philosophize about it. And that is actually the sort of training that I had throughout my entire time there. And I would say now that I'm going to go to the next slide, this is actually this framework that informed the sort of not just the training I had, but also the work that I was doing from that time when I was a student there, even to the point of time when I'm no longer a student, right? And you can see I put Artscience here right in the middle of things, right? And what does that mean? I mean, you can, if you go in Google, or even if you're students, you can go to your university database, right? Your library database, and you just type in Artscience, you find there like tons and tons of work on that. In fact, I am at this point also trying to revise an article on Artscience Collaboratory for Leonardo, the journal, which basically sent back to me my original draft and said you have to R&R, which is revise. It's almost like reject and rewrite in a sense. They like the idea, but didn't like my presentation. So I'm redoing it. And the process, I'm just starting to read even more. I mean, I already started reading a lot, but I'm actually finding more stuff because there are a lot of things that you might look through the first phase and you didn't discover it. And then when you look through again and again and again, maybe using different combinations of keywords, and maybe by looking at somebody's bibliography, writing bibliography of an article that entices you or that interests you, you find a lot more stuff. And through all these different articles, I actually been reading a lot. I think more constantly. I mean, I've always been reading about art science, but never specifically the concept, right? I always read stuff on the arts and then on the science, like the specific objects relating to art science, but never art science itself. But I would say that the person who had introduced this concept to me was actually a neuroscientist who was at the time a postdoc at the university that I was at. He was introduced to me by another professor who also thought my work was a bit strange but intriguing and thought it might actually overlap well with this person. And he ran a workshop Artscience that I actually crashed. One thing about being abroad, right, is that you have to learn not to be shy. You have to learn to like crash things if you feel that it will actually benefit you, like talking to people, asking for permission to be part of something, right? And this was something very new to me because we were never trained or taught, to do that, right? I mean, not like I never crashed things before I did, but never in such an overt manner where you just go up to people and say, can I come to a workshop, which I know I'm not signed up for? And you probably have not thought of including me, but can I just show up anyway? So doing things like that. So that actually itself is part of the entrepreneurial spirit that I'm talking about. And this represents that as well. And one of the things that struck me at the workshop was this saying that says that there are lots of people who try to do art and science. And this is not a new term. People have been doing this for a long time. I would say even when this word has even become very corporatized in the sense that, people, if you go to the corporate world, there are people who would say that we want to do art science projects because it will help improve the products that we will put out, right? And there is actually a book called Artscience, someone by David Edwards. I have a book here somewhere. I'll look it up later. I kind of forgot. I think it's David Edwards. But anyway, I listed that book actually in the bibliography of my book, which I'll share with you later if I have some time.
What year, Clarissa?
Sorry?
What year is the book?
I know it's published by Harvard Press, and I think it was published early this century, 2000. Something is actually in the bibliography. In fact, yeah, my book is on the side here. Or maybe Prahasno, if you can find it, you can dig it up and let everyone know, right? And that book is actually by a guy who is an engineer who was basically thinking of, but he did interviews with a bunch of different people who came from very interesting background. Like one of them was a concert pianist turned engineer who decided to bring together her experience as a performer, a musician, and engineer to create a field that no one actually has heard of or has practiced, right? But the thing was also that she was able to do it because she was also privileged, and she was doing it in a very privileged position, and she also had a very privileged space in universities. And one of the things that I noticed, especially, but anyway, I'm going ahead of myself, but all this thing, ethics, curiosity, experimenting, inventing, right, that sort of like circulates around this idea of art science. And how art science itself sometimes can actually be mistaken to be, just doing art and science together. Like, for instance, I'm an artist and I feel that, I'm trapped in this in a way and I'm not having any real inspiration. I'm going to go to the sciences. Oh, this is a really aesthetically pleasant thing, right? And I try to take inspiration from that and put it into my art. And that, as I learned from the workshop that I mentioned earlier, is not actually art science. It's actually just someone who is in art and want to take some inspiration from the sciences. Art science is much more than that, right? Science is also like, some scientists may think, oh, I'm doing art science if I take some very beautiful visuals of my experiment or the object that I'm working on, and then presenting in an aesthetically pleasing way, or I do data visualization in a way that is quite beautiful, because there are lots of data visualization that is quite pretty, right? But that is not art science. But to go back to what art science is, and to go back to the space of where it usually takes place, it usually takes place in a very privileged space. Privileged not just in terms of resources and money, but privileged also in terms of infrastructure, which is something that unfortunately we are kind of lacking in Malaysia, because a lot of the universities that we actually try to be like, right? Like overseas, we say, oh, it's so cool, MIT can do this, or it's so cool that you can do that. But the reality is that we don't actually have that privileged infrastructure that support all this kind of work, right? That draw people who are attracted to this kind of work. See, because, to be able to draw, it's kind of like, why bees are drawn to honey, right? And it's like, or you see, if you leave like sugar out, in your kitchen, suddenly you see more and more ants showing up, right? So there's always something when there's something that can draw a magnet to draw you in, more and more people will get drawn to that space. And to be able to create that space that will draw people of all kinds, especially people with, talents and skills and knowledge as well as experience to contribute, is itself a privilege. And in fact, to be in a space where you can bring all these four things together, curiosity, inventing, experimenting, ethics. I didn't put also another term there, which is also to fail, right? Which is actually somewhere in there. It's actually a kind of privilege. So if you look beyond this box, there's also these other four bits, like the keyblad, right? The east, west, north, south, east, west. So I'm not saying that logic is north and intuition and feeling is south. I'm actually just positioning them in this space, not to say that one is east or west, but it's rather to show that this basically represents the compass in which we tend to operate, whether in art science or even beyond art science work, including in work that are not seriously art science, but probably art-inspired science or science-inspired art, which are very different things. So there's the actual and the virtual, which also represent the space of the operation. So we talk about in the sciences, there is increasing distance between you as the experimenter, for instance, if we are talking about experimental sciences, and the object of experiment, because you have mediation, right? Because there are so many things between you. If you're doing stuff that are very microscopic, that cannot be accessed by the human eye, you definitely were using a lot of instruments, many of which are computerized and digital instruments. So, and that created the sensation of virtuality. I mentioned this actually in the book where I cited the work actually by Peter Gallison, who is also a very privileged as well as a very interesting individual whom I only met very briefly in the conference. He's a historian of science who had, I think, a PhD training in physics before that. And he is a practicing physicist come historian of science at the same time. And he's doing all this in Harvard. And I say it's also it's not an art science existence, but it's very interesting how a lot of the work that he was actually playing with in terms of, for instance, looking at the presentation of data or how people interpret data and even the form in which the data must take before the interpretation can take place is actually also inspired by art, right? And in the privileged space where you have different disciplines, where you can have that constant conversation, where you can knock at the professor's door and say, hey, I want to hear what you have to say about the bird song, right? Because I actually met a physicist by accident, who is the head of a physics department, because one of my supervisors was actually a physicist. That's a long story, I won't go into that. And I found out later that he was working with a biologist on bird songs because they were actually trying to use physics and biology to look at the brain of the bird and studying it through the bird song. And this is before quantum biology, which is an area I mentioned a little bit in the book, but I didn't go into. Also, coincidentally, there was somebody who came to Malaysia who gave a talk on quantum biology 2 years ago. I actually mentioned his work in my book. He and his co-author actually has co-written an easy-to-access book on quantum biology, which I actually cited as well in the bibliography of my book. So anyway, to go back to the actual and the virtual. So there's this idea of the actual. I mentioned what the virtual is. Then there is this idea of the actual. So the actual itself is not just about the reality. I mean, reality is part of the actual, but the actual also represents actuating, right? So to something that realized itself, but it's always in the process of realizing. So it's never one definite realization, but it keeps realizing itself. I will show you what I mean later through some of my actual work. So there's logic, and then there's intuition and feeling. I think for this, probably we'll go to the last, towards the end of this talk before we go back into that. But just so to say that intuition and feeling itself, it's not just, oh, you know, I intuit something. It's not just something that is just completely raw, but it's also a process of becoming creative. And this is where I get very inspired by the work of another philosopher who was actually originally a mathematician who got interested in history towards the end of his career. Well, not really. You know, I won't say the end of his career, but towards the second half of his career, right? Alfred North Whitehead. He was the guy who also co-wrote a book on logic with Bertrand Russell that I think very few people read. But he later on in life wrote another book called Process and Reality, which is one of the most difficult books to read. And I read it twice and I still cannot, I read it twice completely. And then later on, I obviously can't read it the time completely because it really takes a lot of time. And I went back to look bits and pieces of it. And it's interesting how he connects feeling with logic. And I think it's easier for me to show you what I'm trying to do through that rather than to, explain it. So the next part I'm going to show you now is, let's think about this paradigm that we're looking at here. I'm going to call this the paradigm right now in terms of normal science, which is the Kuhnian logic, right? Which is usually associated with puzzle solving. And then let's add puzzle solving to making and building. Early forms of science is actually not as you think. It's not something you just learn, you didn't study science back in the day by reading textbooks. Yes, textbooks are useful, but textbooks are not the only means in which you actually play with science. A lot of science actually have this beginning in what they call tinkering, right? Which is to tinker. Tinker basically means, for instance, it's like what you do with your car because you want to find out what is inside it. Or for kids, maybe they may take apart a watch. Or what you see, probably if any of you have small children, you've probably seen kids taking apart things. That's also a form of tinkering as well. So puzzle solving, making and building actually come together, but they represent different ways of doing. One is maybe more cognitive, but the other one at the bottom is the realization of the cognitive, right? And then we talk about syncretism, which is basically trying to bring things together in ways that when they come out, they look different from when they first came together. Oops. And then deconstruction. And of course, you can, as I say, it's almost like a tinkering process. You can take something apart, but then when you try to put it back, it may not even look the way it looked like. Maybe because you didn't know how to put it back properly, or it could be that you find maybe you should put it back differently than the way it used to look like, right? So deconstruction means that it's taking apart something. It's actually a theoretical term. There's a philosophical discussion around it, but I won't go into that so much. But I put it in opposition to syncretism, because syncretism actually is less about taking things apart, but about more of integrating things so that you get something that is emergent, something that is lain daripada yang pernah dinampak, yang lain daripada yang didapati. So that's what that is. And then all this falls under this whole larger world of the Anthropocene, right? Anthropocene basically is our human relationship to our world, and usually is to our natural world. And how is that going to look like? Perhaps don't mention the warisan and also the connection to Nusantara that I'm interested in. And one of the things that we probably don't usually associate as closely, even though I think it's kind of like changing right now, is that a lot of the process of making and doing, building, you know, all these concepts that I have here is very tied into our relationship to nature. In fact, the first, I would say, our first creative source actually came from nature, from our experiment on the ground. When I say on the ground, it's literally on the ground, not on the cement ground, but on the tanah, on earth itself, right? So, and ethics, curiosity, experimenting, inventing. I mean, there's ethics in how we relate to nature and what we do with nature. Nature is not just there for us to extract value, but it's also for us to give back value to. And Anthropocene actually is one big area of discourse around climate justice, right? And as well among indigenous knowledge, and also basically back to the question of actualization means to also regain agency over what has been taken away from you. So it's also talking about rights, but it's not talking about a single community's rights, but how the rights of one community can affect all the others around them. So it's a form of a biosystem as well. So this ends the more theoretical part of my presentation. Any question before I move to the next part, which is going to be less theoretical, but not less difficult? I hope it's not too difficult. Any question from anybody? Feel free to ask if you have.
Where is the name of the mathematician, historian? Alfred what?
Alfred North Whitehead.
Oh man, what's the spelling?
Like White, just look for Whitehead. Look for A-N Whitehead. WHITEHEAD.
Okay, is he was he a contemporary of Bertrand Russell?
He was contemporary of Bertrand Russell, even though I think he might be younger than Bertrand Russell, because they are both born in the 19th century, but I think Bertrand Russell was born before him.
Okay, so he was he belongs to that group, Russell.
No, he was not part of that group. No, he's not part. He's not the Vienna. He's neither the Vienna Circle group nor the Cambridge. I don't think there's a name for the Cambridge group, but not a part of the Cambridge group. I would say that he is also in a way contemporary to another philosopher called Ludwig Wittgenstein. I don't know if most of you have read Wittgenstein. He's also another difficult guy to read. Very difficult. And so because I think he's difficult to read, because I think he's also autistic, but that's just me guessing. He is the guy who actually created the first elevator in a house for his sister in Austria. Like the first elevator in Europe was built by him. He's an engineer. Wittgenstein.
What's your what's your take on Russell and Tesla?
Russell and who?
Tesla.
Tesla. You mean Nikola Tesla?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know a lot about Nikola Tesla actually. I mean, Nikola Tesla I know him more as a tinkerer, experimenter, less of as a theorist. Whereas Russell is not really a scientist. He is a logician. In fact, there is a book called Logicomics. It's co-written by, well, it's actually co-produced by a logician and, well, actually, there are a few people in the book. One is a logician, and I think the other one is computer scientist. But the drawings were done by some artists who were also interested in the topic. So it's called Logicomics, which is actually about the life of Bertrand Russell and his work. Bertrand Russell, how would I put it? He belongs to, if you want to separate out between, I don't know, dawn of the age, new modern science and not so modern science, I guess you can say that Bertrand Russell sits at the cusp of it. Nikola Tesla, I don't think he ever self-identified as a scientist. I think this is something that people call him, refer to him to later, but he was definitely a tinkerer. And he was one of the people who contributed a lot, to the development, the technologization of electromagnetic knowledge, right? So if you want to say, I would say it's better to compare maybe Maxwell, the guy who created the 4 equations for electromagnetism. I'm not sure if there are any scientists here. If you're a physicist, you may know what I'm talking about. Maxwell and Russell, rather than Tesla and Russell.
Russell, I've seen many diagrams by Russell, and I found that Russell, through that diagram, is more a philosopher.
Yeah, Russell is a logician, philosopher, mathematician. So, and definitely logicians are very much into diagrams. In fact, a lot of us who have been trained in, I mentioned models in the beginning of my talk. Right? So diagramming itself is also part of the modeling process. And when we talk about virtual, right? The reason why, like in physics, I probably can speak better to physics because of my background and the fact that I also studied physics for my PhD. I may not study physics as a physicist, but studied the topic as a, humanist, is that the diagram actually is a way for mediating, as a way of helping you communicate with the object, because you have no direct access to the object. It's not an object that you can hold anymore. In fact, the object is virtual. You want to put your hand there, you don't even know whether it's there. You don't know whether it's there, right? You trust your senses and you trust the medium to tell you that the thing is there. Of course, if you don't trust it, then maybe or you can't do anything about that. And then the diagramming itself is the way for you to make sense of that trust, so that you feel that you're not trusting in vain, if that makes sense. Because it's so virtual, it's not something I can pick up, right? So you need something to make it concrete, and the diagram allows it to be concretized. And I think that's actually why it's different. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me, Dr. Chong here, Gallison?
Yeah?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
It's like this. You see, back to our Bertrand Russell. During my high school days, that was many years ago.
Yeah.
6 years ago, when I was in KL, I was very keen on Bertrand Russell. I read his book on this thing on what they call this logic as applied to mathematics. But a few years later, I was in high school. I found out that there was a big discovery by Kurt Gödel. Gödel's book. Have you heard about that?
So it's by what? Sorry?
By Gödel, G-O-E-D-E-L, a German, what they call philosopher. So Gödel came up with
Gödel. Okay.
Gödel came up with the proof that actually trying to do mathematics using pure logic is a pure waste of time.
Yes.
Gödel proved that you would say that, okay, I want to come up with a computer that can create new theorems, create new mathematics. It cannot be done. Right? When you use pure logic axiom to come up with new things, it is actually incomplete. So basically what Gödel proved is that human intuition linearly, not in the rational way. So human intuition come up with new proof. Whereas if you use pure logic, you can never come up with new ideas. So once I knew about that discovery by Kurt Gödel in high school, I did try to understand logic, mathematics, Bertrand Russell. And you know, just to let you know, Tesla, you know that Kurt Gödel eventually ended up in where? Princeton University. Not Princeton University.
Yeah, I know I know that he tried. I know that's actually like where his incompleteness theorem came to, and I know that was something that Russell was working on. Sorry.
So, and Gödel came up with that proof. All the mathematicians tried to prove that using pure logic, they throw up, waste of time, no point. Anyway, that's the story. I was in high school, I read that. Gödel eventually ended up in Princeton University. He was a German, but ended up in this USA, in this Princeton University. And who is another famous occupant of Princeton University? Albert Einstein. Since whenever Albert Einstein see Kurt Gödel coming towards Einstein, Albert Einstein will pay a big respect to Kurt Gödel. But to Albert Einstein, the incompleteness theorem of Gödel is a big discovery in human philosophy, human knowledge. That's what I want to say. Basically,
thank you.
Don't waste your time trying to use logic to prove. That's a pure waste of time. Okay? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Clarissa?
Yeah.
Just to intervene a bit. By the way, to everybody, Dr. Chong Yu is my physics Shifu. My
physics teacher.
Yoda of physics. So he used to be, he's still my advisor on physics and sciences for the Muzium and Galeri Tuanku Fauziah. He's also already retired, but he used to be a physics professor. So anyway, thank you, Dr. Chong.
Thank you.
Probably we would invite him later. He has so many things that he can share. But very interesting. I have another thing that I want to add. We have to bring this a bit to the arts because it's now going a bit to the sciences. I see most
That's the next stage.
Most of the participants here are mostly art-based. Okay. As far as the art is concerned, especially if you look back at the history of modern contemporary art in the West, especially in USA, there was a period in the 1960s where there was this thing called EAT, or Experiment in Art and Technology, where they had people like Robert Rauschenberg, Merce Cunningham, choreographer, working with technologies, with engineers to come up with a collaborative performance that combined highly experimental approach and also technological approach towards the art. But there was also a precedent when it comes to trying to come up with a convergence between scientific thinking and artistic thinking, and it was called EA art. But I think there are many other examples. There's so many. So if you look back to some books, we can see this example. Okay, I think I can continue now. I'm interested, excited to know more.
Okay, let's go back to the art now. Actually, this is actually something. One of the things that I like to do is actually to solve puzzles, even though I don't think I'm very good at them, but they relax me. And I was actually doing this one Sunday because I was working on something, but I got fed up and bored, so I decided to do puzzles. But one thing was that when I was doing this is actually some puzzle blocks that I actually bought when I was in Australia, and it's very simple actually. It's a very simple, and whoever came up with this is actually pretty ingenious. It's actually a bunch of you can see on the left side, right? There's like these blocks of flat wood blocks that are not very even. I mean, they are properly rigid, obviously, and they're like in actual angles and cutouts, but they are not in a very regular pattern, right? And I was trying to, and this block came with some bunch of like patterns that you can actually try to reproduce. And I thought, it can't be too difficult. And I found that it's actually a lot more difficult than I thought, because it took me probably almost an hour and a half to come out to bring all this bunch of blocks on the left to make it look like what is on the right. Because I tried many things that should be familiar and should be most commonsensical, and none of them work. And one day I decided, and I consciously told myself, you know what, let's do something that I might not think might work, or let's do something that is a little bit incongruent to what is regular, or it's not so commonsensical. Do something irregular. So I decided to take all the regular looking blocks, and put them in very weird positions, and the more irregular stuff, put them in where I normally have put the regular blocks. And this is actually what I came up with, and this was exactly the pattern that I was trying to reproduce, and this was that pattern itself. So this is basically what research creation is about. It's sometimes taking things that you thought is commonsensical, familiar, should go into all the right places, and then suddenly finding that, okay, it looks like it's almost like that, but it's something that's actually not quite right. There's something missing there. And then having to dismantle it again, and then try many different ways until you finally realize that you probably have to take parts that are irregular to put in the places where the regular should be, and then take the regular stuff and put in the location where you expect the irregular to be. And then you finally actually can get what is, this thing is not to say that this is like the perfect piece, but it's basically to say that research creation that makes sense, because this is what I'm trying to show here. The picture on the right is to show you something that don't make sense turn out into something that makes sense. It's basically what research creation is all about. And when you do a lot of research creation that is in the art and science world, this is actually basically what you actually encounter on a regular basis if you actually want to persist in that direction. And unfortunately, that also means that you have to be able to build in timeline for things that look okay, but you're not sure if it's okay, or things that don't look perfect, but it worked for a while, or things that may look perfect, but it takes too long to actually get that. And this is basically the problem of research creation. And okay, and here is also another way to think about research creation that I actually borrowed from my speculative design work, right? Speculate, brainstorm, design, research processes. And the reason why I put them in this form rather than just put 4 squares in front of you is because to show you that they don't actually operate in a very linear top to bottom order. This is the thing. Unfortunately, my thing is not animated. Otherwise, I will show you how I can spin this thing around, right? And when you spin these things around, that means the order of things actually changes, right? I mean, there are a lot of times that people will try to design something before they even try to brainstorm. And after they design, and then they try, and when the process of brainstorming, maybe you should speculate a little bit more. So, and then the research process actually embodies all of it, right? Research process is evident in each of these parts, because you might speculate on something, then you thought about something that you heard of, but you're not sure. You went and read it, you go and read it up, or you go and look at examples of that. So that's the research process. And brainstorming and designing actually co-occurs. And this is something that I will actually want to show you as well in my work. And art. How do you bring art into all of this, right? So now I have all these things in a nice, orderly manner. What happens when you slip art in? And this is actually when I want to come to the exercises of my book. So the exercise I'm going to show you, which is actually me trying to bring together exercise 1 and exercise 2 together. So exercise 1, just to explain, because it's hard for me to switch back and forth. Otherwise, I can show you the flip of my book, but I will just explain because it's a lot faster. I'll show you the flip later. The brainstorm session is basically me getting the reader or the person who's doing this exercise, maybe not even having read the book, they just want to look at the exercise, they just want to play with the exercises, is to basically what I try to get them to do is actually to brainstorm a project that they think they want to develop. It can be an artistic project, it can be a more intellectual project, or it can just be something they want to do because they're bored. So you can combine different skills, right? Some people who come in, they are better at drawing and visualizing, they don't like to write, so you can use that. And if they want to write or draw or doodle, they can do that as well. But the thing is that this one actually borrows research processes that people always, associate with doing research in non-artistic sense to actually design sessions in a way that's systematic but not constraining. So there's a lot of back and forth that actually happens there. So this is actually what it is. And also to help out the reader or the person using this, I basically show them examples. Okay, you can take stuff from the different readings that is already in the book to do that. Unless if you have no idea how to start, this is just to as a sort of like a training wheels for you. And then after that, you can go and do your own thing. The second one is actually a full-blown game. Well, it's actually just a short game, but it's still a full-blown game that I kind of designed, which actually can be used in the class setting as well. And I'll show you what they look like. In fact, I'll show you just a small bit of what they look like because I can't show you the full game. So this is the illustration done by the graphic artist for this book. So the Frankenstein Creature, the reason why I chose that as the premise for the game, right? And this is actually where Artscience comes in very strongly, even though it's not something that comes in a very explicit way. Because we always know who Frankenstein is. In fact, for when I was a kid, when I first came across the book Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, most of you probably encountered it not from the book itself, which was published in 1818, but from the movies that you have watched, or maybe even the cartoons. There's always like the Frankenstein monster, right? And for the longest time, I thought the monster was called Frankenstein. Later on, I found out, no, Frankenstein is the creator of this so-called monster. But I don't want to call this person a monster, but a creature, right? So, and the third point here is basically to show you the sort of the beginning of the book, right? Victor Frankenstein, university student, right, who wanted to do something different from all the other medical students who are his peers, because he's so bored with, the normal medical studies. So decided that he wanted to see if he can take dead things and turn them into life. And the result of this is the picture that you actually see on your right. There's this article that I actually referenced that tells you the beginnings and also the background around the creation from the strange and twisted life of Frankenstein. You can go look it up yourself on Google. It's available for free because I was reading it as well, which is actually very interesting. And of course, you can go look up the story of the Mary Shelley who wrote it. She is actually the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, the woman who wrote the first feminist tract, The Vindication of Women, and then philosopher called William Godwin, who wrote the book Samuel Caleb, who is sort of like a, not libertarian, sort of like a what you consider as the liberal, but liberal probably in the John Stuart Mill tradition rather than the liberals that we associate with liberalism today. So, and she obviously was very much influenced by her surrounding. This was during the Romance period. So I say Romance period, sorry. This was during the Romantic period. She's the wife of Shelley, the poet as well. And during this period, it was immediately after Enlightenment, which maybe some of you are more familiar with. Right, Enlightenment was the one that followed after, that came after Renaissance, right? So Enlightenment is all about logic, right? Like everything should come from what you can see, and then you do a series of deduction from that. The Romantic period actually tried to push against that over, how to say that? There's sort of like the over preoccupation with logic. And in fact, this work was created as a critique against that logic, the very humanist-centered logic, to the point where the humans became so there's so much hubris. They get so arrogant that they think they can do anything, which created basically what was considered as the monster. So what I want to do was to actually create a game around this, because there's so many ethical, technological issues around it. But rather than locating this creature in the 19th century, I actually put them forward into an unknown timeline of an alternate world. And what I did was basically I bring together the brainstorm exercise and the original game that I created into this new game, which is nothing at all like the part 2. The exercise 2 at all. So what I want to do, if you want to go do this with me here, is that if you all have a piece of paper, I want you to basically pick from this column something that actually that kind of interests you. Probably from ecology, there are 4 choices. Biology, there are 4 choices. Neuroscience, there are 4 choices. Social, there is also 10 different choices. Initially, what I want to do is for each of you to pick one of each, one only. But then I kind of realized that because there's so many of you, so it might be a little bit hard to do this. So what I'm going to do is to ask each of you to just pick one of these. You don't have to write everything down. If this fire, just write fire. The long explanation is just to help you know what the hell am I picking. So it's actually just that. So if you can pick one of each, I'll give you like a 1 minute to do that. Just pick one of each. Don't worry about how they're supposed to go together. Pick one of each, and then kind of write it down. Later, I'll want you to. Someone wants to annotate something. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, just pick one of each first, and then I'll go on to the next. So what we're gonna do is we're actually trying to build the creature. So imagine that you are Frankenstein, and you are in this alternate world where this creature, we don't know what this creature will look like yet. But you're going to actually have all these little building blocks, and then we'll see what we can come up with. And one thing I will basically ask of all of you is don't think of the creature as something that is must look like a monster or human. It can actually be a concept. So we're going to actually start from that. So kind of free your mind from any sort of prejudice or biases or, a notion that the creature must look like something, but just think of it as a concept at this point. Like even human beings, right? You start from a fertilized egg. So you don't even look like a human. So let's start from that. Then I'll move on to the next stage. Then we're going to do the next thing. So make sure you write this down, because when I actually turn on the whiteboard, I won't be able to show you the PowerPoint anymore because I tested this now. I can't do both at the same time. Okay. Right. Why is this thing annotated? Okay, anyway, I'm not going to annotate on this. So I hope you all pick something. I'm going to go on to the close annotation. Okay. Right. Now, I want you, initially I was going to ask you to pick two, but I decided for each of you, just pick one word. So you already picked the 5 different attributes. So pick one word. There are 5 different words here, right? Don't write everything down, because unless you're a really fast writer, just make notes to help you remember which word you have selected. I'll read it to help you a bit. So the first one is very simple. Everyone is born to be able to read each other's minds, right? Second one, 50% of the citizens are born either deaf or blind. So you know idea who is born deaf or blind, but 50% of them are born either deaf or blind. They have one of these things, but they have eidetic memory and beyond average intelligence. So they're actually very, very smart. So and remember it's 50%, okay, not 100%. So that's world 2. World 3, every citizen, for instance, this is actually a little bit more playing around with the whole business finance idea, but in a kind of like a very sort of social justice sort of way, but we'll see how we go from here. So in this world, every citizen is given a starting sum of money where they are born to serve their every need, but when they die, all their property will be repossessed by a collective pool. So that means you're given the money, so everyone starts equally, right? So you don't have to worry this person is richer or poorer, because there's no inherited wealth. Because once you die, everything goes back to the collective pool, so you cannot will this to your next generation. So imagine a world where it is like that. So how different would that be? So it's still playing with the idea of money. So there's still not like in this world there's no money, but rather there is still money. So something that you're familiar with, but then it's taking place in the world in a way that is unfamiliar. This is not even communist countries, because in communist country their property is not repossessed in this manner. Sure, a lot of things are taken by state, but if that was the case, China won't be as rich as it is, won't be rich through inherited through inherited wealth the way it has become today. Okay, so world 4. So in this world, every citizen is allowed to choose an advantage they would like to have as an adult when they turn 18. So they only get it when they turn 18. So the advantage could be either physical, intellectual, or material. Of course, they cannot choose to be immortal. There's no such thing. So they will still die in the end. And for each advantage they get from one category, they will lose advantage in the other 2 categories. Sorry, misspelling here. Other 2 categories. So, for example, if physical advantage is the choice, they will lose out in intellectual and material advantages. So regardless of what they were born with, So that means once you decided, okay, I prefer to be very good in this area, right? Which maybe is an area that's intellectual, you're going to lose out in physical material. Maybe you become more sickly, right? So you're not strong. So you always fall sick. Or in terms of material, in the sense that you will never be wealthy. And bear in mind that all these worlds are parallel universes, okay? They are not part of the same world, so they are different worlds. So don't think that, you know, World 4 and World 2 contradict each other. No, they don't, because they are not part of the same world. Then there's World 5, where everyone, this is probably the Benjamin Button, is it Benjamin Button, that movie? Yeah, inspired by that. Everyone's born old, but you will grow younger by the year. At the same time, there's no terminal diseases. However, each person will be born with at least one sensory deficit. So imagine a world where your one person is either blind, deaf, mute, or physically disabled. So there's no one who is considered able-bodied in this sense. And the limitations of doing a game like this is that I still have to use the language that people are familiar with. So in a sense, I'm still in a way attributing certain values, right? When I say, oh, blind, deaf, mute, physically disabled, so they're still disabled, right? Because I can't use any other language to represent this. So this is also something that you probably would think about as artists. When you think, oh, I want to do something that no one has done before, you know, something that push against boundaries, restrictions, and all that. But you probably also realize no matter what you try to do, you're still constrained by the vocabulary of the world that you live in, no matter how much you try to push against that. So I'm sure you picked one already by the time I read all this. Let's go to this next stage. So what I want you to do is to choose a role, whichever role you want to be. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to ask volunteers to come up and do something. Here, I don't know how many people are left in this. When I was seeing, there was like 70 old people, but it doesn't matter. We will just try to do this. If I was running this as a workshop rather than an online talk, I probably would have broken you all to different groups and you all be doing different things, and there will actually be very interesting outcome at the end of it. I've done something similar actually 2 years ago for a futurology workshop, where the people that come even more confusing because they come from very different backgrounds, but the ending was still more interesting than if I were just to talk. So I hope you pick something. Let's go on to the next. Right. So what I'm going to do right now, oops, sorry, is for you to look at some of these questions, but I don't think we will really have time to get into too much of it. But why you already pick what you're supposed to pick. So I want you to think of these things. So in the interest of time, I may not want to do too much to that, but I just want you to be aware that when you pick all these things, you're not with all those building blocks that you have, those raw materials that you have selected. You have to basically, firstly, create a creature that can adjust well to the world you'll be living in, right? You have to be fair to the creature. You don't become like the poor Frankenstein creature where it was basically left to fend for itself and then to die a horrible death. And then secondly, what would you do to ensure that the creature could adjust emotionally and socially to the world it's living in, the world you have picked for it to live in? You picked that world for it, right? I think yeah. So that's one. So one is adjusting physically, the other is emotionally and socially. These are the three things that was actually tackled in the book Frankenstein. So if you you read the book, you will know what I'm talking about. So then what should the creature be equipped with to live a good, happy life in the world? And this actually will come from your role, the role that you have selected for yourself. What are your capability in providing that skills to this creature based on your expertise? In reality, this game is actually a lot longer and there's more explanation, but I can't do it in this talk. So what I did was basically to pick up bits and pieces of it. So these are basically to go back to the 4 parts I show you: ethics, curiosity. Ethics, I don't think I'll have time to go into that, but I'll just show you what it looks like later on. And then to invent. And this is actually what our next thing would be. Okay, I have to close the annotation because every time it's open, I cannot. So now I'm going to unshare, the screen. Oh, you can hear me, right? Okay. Yeah. I thought I unmuted myself accidentally. Okay, I'm going to unshare this one, and I'm going to now open to the. I want everyone to write down. Oh dear, how do I? Can someone show me how to open the
Yeah, it's already there.
The whiteboard? Because I can't see the whiteboard. Oh, I have to share the whiteboard, is it? Okay, right. So what I'd like to do is maybe somebody would like to volunteer what they have selected and probably write it down. I have the reference stuff with me, so I would know what you do. So anybody here would like to try and see? Let's see, this is annotation. I saw a few people requesting annotation capabilities just now, so I assume that means they want to write something. Or if you feel like you can't write, you can also type what your choices are. But if you can write, it's actually even better. And I think I can allow everybody to annotate. Okay, everybody can annotate now. So take a rectangle, maybe put it as a square, and then kind of like type on that. You notice just now I put small, like sort of like acronyms, so you may actually want to put that in. So this is actually more of a storytelling game, in the sense that if you're alone, if you're with people, you may actually want to speak out what you are, what you're building, right? But if you're alone, you may actually be just kind of doing and doing sort of like a mind mapping around that. So someone pick world 1. So world 1 is this is the one where everybody, let me go check my, I need to open this. So world 1 is basically what, everybody with the ability to read each other's minds. Oops. Sorry. I got too many windows on my, okay. So that's the healer. So robotic helper. Anything else? The healer is the role, but what about the stuff that you selected just now from the columns? So for the parts, it's ecology, biology, neuroscience, and social. First one is soil, water, fire, and wood. That's ecology. Biology is stem cells, genetic material from, this is actually inspired by the whole COVID thing. So it's like weakened genetic material from the virus. So it's a viral material. Third one, controlled mutation. Means it's something that can mutate, but you can control it. And then cryogenics basically means to deep freeze something until it can live. There are others as a reminder. Neuroscience, there's a chip you can put into the brain that can extend your short-term memory. It's almost like adding like a storage capacity to your brain, so you can hold, actually not storage capacity, it's like adding RAM to your memory, because RAM in the computer actually allows the computer to maintain short-term memory so that it can hold more information, right, without overloading. So you add more RAM, so it's equivalent to the idea, adding a chip. Alpha wave enhancer basically has to do with the waves that produced by your brain when you are awake and when you are sleeping, right? So basically when you reach the theta and delta part of the brain, basically it means that you're at the sort of like the deep sleep mode where you're in between dreaming and waking, but you're actually still sleeping. So imagine if you can actually control that, which also means you can control the emotions and, you know, stress level, because these are all connected to emotions and stress. And then sensory enhancer, where you can amplify your senses. Imagine, you know, you have bionic senses and chemical neurotransmitters. So basically it means that, you know, in the world out there, there's a lot of data out there which we cannot access, right? We cannot feel it because we are not built to do that. So now you actually have the ability to kind of like capture all of it. So thank you. Right. So this is basically the, so there's world 5, some people pick world 4 and world 1. So what I would actually have done that, let's say for world 4, let's start with 1 first here. So world 4 is, okay, let me go back to that. is this world where citizen is allowed to choose an advantage, right? Or at the expense of other advantage. So, and then, so the ecology bit is, so you're actually giving the 5 elements. I probably should ask all of you to pick only one element from each. Oh, okay, you pick one, water, right? So water is the element. It's probably also the strength that you're actually giving to that creature. So, and then of course, something that's genetic. So genetic material from the virus, which is actually very powerful, because if you can manipulate the viral genetic material, you can actually manipulate a lot of things in this world, because they have the ability to mutate very fast and transmit very quickly, as we found with the COVID cases as well. And then sensory means enhanced sensory ability. And then the diet planner is, yeah, I think this is from the social part. Basically, it means that you're able to, okay, let me go back down there, sorry. Yeah, so diet planner also means that it can mean different things. Obviously, I intentionally left it very vague, because in the actual game itself, I will actually have the participant talk about what does this diet planner do. It can be somebody who basically can control, for instance, I mean, you can give them superpower, like they can actually, which is actually, these are all superpowers, but it can be something very mundane, just like, oh, you know, somebody who knows how to plan diet so that everyone eats properly and healthily, which is very mundane, maybe what a dietitian might do. But there's also the diet planner, is that somebody has the ability to use diet, right, to manipulate and change, let's say, conditions of, let's say, in this case, the creature they're kind of living in. So this is actually a narrative building game. And as I say, in the actual game itself, you will be doing a lot. There's actually more structure. Here, I couldn't give the structure, so I let you guys kind of like run a little bit more amok, but there's actually structure behind each of these. Okay, I'm going to move forward because I'm just wary about time. I'm just going to show you something which we unfortunately cannot get into, but I want to, this is actually taken from the book. So access to the book, you will know, oh wait, I have to unshare this. I can't go back and forth. I have to unshare and reshare. Okay, share my screen again. Okay, so this is actually taken from current slide. This is actually taken from the book. So technically, once you started creating and inventing like the world for this creature that you're also inventing and creating, and also, and that what you were doing just now is also a process experimenting, because in the actual game you actually be talking to each other, maybe even agreeing and disagreeing as to whether this will work or not. Because in the actual game you will actually also be collaborating, but I have to skip that part completely altogether, because as I said, this will have been the 2-hour game on its own without all these things, right? So this is basically the final bit. Actually, it's almost the final bit. This is the assessment bit, where you have to think about this creature you're bringing to the world, this particular world you've chosen for it, and then as an expert, are you able actually to even consider all these things? And this is basically a game that tries to simulate the real sort of like situation in the world that sometimes either scientists or even non-scientists are come face to face with, and sometimes they reach the limits of their expertise, right? But at the same time, they have to deal with this, like it or not, because these things are important. So this is basically the first simulation that I want to show you. And the second one, unfortunately, we don't have time to do a lot with it, but we'll see what I can do, because it's almost 4 o'clock. But if you have any questions about the game, yeah, feel free to ask me. You can also interrupt me along the way. I'm going to show you second and the last simulation, which is actually a combination of exercise 3 and exercise 5. Exercise 3 basically is Wounded Karma. To cut the long story short, it's basically your wonderful or your wonder, because karma is actually room. So it's like your curiosity room. People refer to it as the curiosity cabinet, but cabinet is very small. So I prefer to call it as the curiosity room, where you put all the curious stuff. So imagine you have a room, right? It can be a physical room or maybe your own mental room, where you can put in all the incredible stuff that you want to use, either because you want to use it as your imaginary world, you know, for you to escape to when you're feeling too stressed out, or it can be a world that you actually want to use to kind of like develop your artistic abilities. And the fifth part actually is how do you actually design philosophy, basically in practice. So this is where I'm trying to do. So I was very bored one day because, you know, we've been on lockdown for a month. I mean, Selangor has been in lockdown longer than everyone else because we are always in lockdown. Basically, that is our default position, right? So, and I have very little access to Earth because I live in, you know, unfortunately, not really city, but, you know, the suburb, and there's very little greenery. I mean, there is some, but not a lot. This is actually a photo taken from when I was in Singapore and visiting one of the islands of the Singapore country. And that was actually my best memory because this happened just before the first lockdown happened last year in March. I was in Singapore, I rushed back. I was going to stay longer, but I rushed back because I was afraid we cut lock up from the country, right? And came back and I was locked down. So this was a great memory to have. And this, I was thinking about this a lot because I was thinking a lot about soil because it also stems from longing, you know, my sense of detachment from the soil out there in the world, the earth. I was talking about the Anthropocene and our connection to earth. I felt very disconnected. And at the very same time, I was also grappling with the consequence of lockdown is you end up with a lot of plastics. I mean, there's only so much going out and bringing my own containers and tapao and bringing it back. A lot of times, a lot of us call take-in if we are not cooking because you also get bored cooking. And I live alone. You know, it's boring to be cooking for yourself, too, even if it's just twice a day, right? So, and I usually order a lot and keep for many days. So all these containers, actually, I've been thinking about what to do, some work of art with them, because what I want to do is to take all these containers instead of just using it to tap out other things, right? To kind of like pack other things. I want to see if I can actually turn them into what they consider as recycled art. But rather than just taking plastic and make crafts out of it, I want to do a project where I can actually bring plastics and soil. Basically, I was trying to show the soil in the picture on the left together, and that itself started even long before the whole MCO thing. This was when I was thinking about initially creating my own chemistry garden, basically like, you know, picking plants that represent certain that contain certain chemical elements that I actually am very interested in and wondering what I can do with that. But along the way, I mean, that didn't really happen because I got very busy and by the time I was free to do all this, we were on lockdown, so I can't even go and get all the materials, right? So I was thinking that it would actually be interesting to collect all these different soils, and instead of just thinking about what to grow with them, think about what is in the soil itself. And then not just put the soil in the plastic, but figure out what can plastic and soil do when you put them together. So this one on the left is from, as I say, magical versions of the items. This is actually from the, I call it magical versions because this is actually apart from the exercise, the Wunderkammer exercise I just showed you just now. So it's that. And this idea actually came from when I was writing an article, which I don't know when it's going to be published, but I gave a talk 2 months ago when I was talking about an example of the Puteri Gunung Ledang story, and also the items that were part of the trozo of the, which is the hantaran, the trozo of the Puteri Gunung Ledang, right? You know, there's like this golden bridge, silver bridge, mosquito huts. Of course, I can't show you mosquito huts, so I show you the mosquitoes. And there's these two quadrants, right? One is I Pinang and one is I Mata. And then this one, the one in the middle, is the one that intrigues me the most because this is actually talking about Hati Kuman. So I was thinking, oh, microbiomes, right? And so far, I managed to find Petri dishes. So I was just thinking, maybe the dulang is the idea of the Petri dish, right? And then, of course, at the bottom, right, they are representing blood cells and blood platelets, and the far right actually is the basically the gunung and all that. So these are basically some of the magical versions of the items that I actually took from that story. And when I just kind of put it there, I was just trying to think about, you know, the anthropocenic elements that's actually in the story. I mean, the story is told in a very metaphorical way, and I'm sure probably the person who wrote it wasn't even thinking in such terms, maybe not. But at the same time, just because you're not thinking about it doesn't mean that you cannot unconsciously be, you know, feeling it and then transmitting it through the stories that were written. And also it helps you think about the cosmology of thinking that was available at that time when that story was written. And I was thinking about all this, and I was trying to connecting to the soil because all this was taking place in a mountain. So in the mountain, there always a lot of soil. I don't have time to show you the video, but I can actually send this, I don't know, I can give it to Prof. Hasno and then post this on the website so you can watch this video. This is actually a BBC video about the magic of soil. right? What is in the soil. The reason why I wanted to show that video
You
is
mean,
because
the anti-depression one, that video?
this is the video here on the right.
On what? On what?
Is this one?
I saw one video on anti-depressant.
Oops, too many videos. No, this is not the video I've shown. So it's actually this one.
Is one of the most underrated and little understood wonders on a fragile planet.
You can actually, if you can, sorry, this thing is a little bit, oh, sorry. My apologies. I'm not very good at controlling my Firefox crashed. So never mind. I won't play that right now. I'm working from a very old laptop. Actually, I need to get a new laptop because of the amount of stuff I do on it. But I will share the link later to NGTF, and you can post it out, and you can all go look at it to watch it. The video actually is. Okay, I'm going to just close this first because the video actually I wanted to show you because I want to show you about what is in the soil itself, and that actually became the premise and the interest for my project because we always focus on what is above the soil, what you can grow on the soil.
It's one of the underrated and little understood wonders.
Okay, so you can go look it up on YouTube. Why soil is one of the most amazing things on earth, the Royal Society. You can look it up and watch it yourself, right? Because I don't want to play it. It's like 4 minutes long, right? And I was looking at this video and I was thinking about how I can do a project that connects plastic, because plastic actually came about also because of the extraction process that we do. We extract from nature and the result of this is plastic. But unlike something that's natural, it cannot decompose. Sure, we talk about not decomposable plastic, but they're not the kind of plastics that is regularly used, and they're not really plastic either. They're just called plastics, but the actual plastics are not decomposable. And we think we can recycle them, but it takes a lot of energy to recycle plastic. I was having a conversation with my sister about how I can turn plastics into Legos, and just talking about how we need to use, big forklifters and big things to like compress them together to get, blocks and then cut them up. That itself takes a lot of resource and also a lot of energy to get to that. Because I was thinking it would be cool to make, toys with recycled plastics, because we already produce so much stuff, so why don't we just recycle what we have? And that actually also connects to my Puteri Gunung Ledang story in itself, right? About how I can take all these different objects and not just think of them just in terms of the story, but think beyond the story and what kind of creative stuff I can build out of it. So I started doing a sort of like a rapid paper prototyping. This was before the talk. I meant to do this, so I'm glad this talk basically kicked my lazy ass and got me to do it sooner, because I like to keep everything in my head and on pieces of paper and not really organize them. So this gave me a chance to organize it. And I always been wanting to do a project using physical computing, but I also want to do it in terms of minimal computing. So I don't want to set up like a laboratory where you do high-tech computing stuff. No, what I want to do is to take computers using all these materials that are natural. Okay, except maybe plastic, which has been extracted from natural resources and turned into something unnatural. So taking that, and how do I actually build computers, right? Not using like silicon chip, which is also another whole discussion on extraction and capitalism, but and fine processing and how that create a lot of other new forms of waste. But how can we actually create computing? This is a bio art project, so in a way it's like a biocomputer. So you're actually using biological materials and seeing that you can build a computer with it. And for doing this, I probably can't do it alone. I probably will need to work with different people with different skill sets, because it's like trying to build a computer using non-natural stuff that you associate with computing. So what would actually be the memory? What would actually be the storage? Where will be the processor be? And what kind of data can you even come up with something like that, right? So, and even though I do not know what the tools will look like, but I have an idea what the purpose are. And this is actually what I wrote them down as. And also, that got me to brainstorm on this side here, the possible relations between plastic and soil, right? So thinking, okay, maybe I can cut plastics out into wiring strips, because the thing about it, the cables we use for computers, they're kind of like a form of plastic, that just maybe not the plastic you use as container, but they are a plastic, right? And then now we think that since plastic is an extraction of materials on Earth, right? So how can we bring that thing that's been extracted and made unnatural, how can we bring back into a more natural relationship with Earth? So that was the other thing I was thinking about. As I say, this is not a project I can just sit in my room and think about it and do it. You know, this one requires talking and to people, and also experimenting and trying things out on my own and with other people. And then plastic extrusion and protector, this came from my idea when I was wanting to do my own, as I say, chemical garden, and having, you know, knowing that if I want to put it in a certain location, how can I protect it? And maybe using plastics as a way of protector. So instead of plastic as waste, we turn plastic into something that can shield, right? That can shield the vulnerable natural resource that we have. And then we think about, of course, plastic as the components for physical computing. This goes back also to my discussion. How can we turn plastic into building blocks? If I don't want to expend too much energy to change the shape of the plastic from what it was, then how can I work with the plastic in the form that it is without having to like put all the energy and add more waste to just to create a plastic? Because, you know, to create a plastic that you can recycle, it's just as much energy and waste as it's a different kind of waste and energy, but it's still waste and energy as it is to make something plastic anew, right? And this is something that we don't really talk about, especially when we make things. So from this rapid prototyping, so it's not really much of a prototype in the sense I don't have a model out yet at this point. Also because I can't go out and get the stuff I want to do it anyway at this point easily, because I will cross district to do that. And I don't have access to my office either. That's where most of my plastics are, you know, stuff I can cut and try to turn and play and paste together. I can't do it at this point. So what this is, I have is a kind of like a plan to help me think about the concepts that I want to work with before I actually do the actual physical building things together. So this is basically the idea I have about, go back to the idea of speculation. You know, this one brings it to a notch up. So it's not just talking about things in terms of what is on the Earth, but also thinking in terms of what kind of knowledge do I want to produce through this project, right? So there's this word of data used here, parameters, right? How does the data look like? Imagine computing a data like that. It's probably nothing like the data you're used to seeing, right? Especially for some of you who work with data visualization, this is probably even a very weird thing. But it's also not very weird because there are other people who have done versions of this before, actually in bioart. And of course, when you think about, you know, when we include data from the Earth, what does that mean? I showed you the video because I wanted to show you all the stuff that's in the Earth. Well, that's basically what I want to do. I want to extract all the stories, all the narratives that is happening in the Earth beyond what we can see, right? So how am I going to actually do that? And how would I code this? This is not your regular programming, you know. It's not like I can learn Ruby, learn Python, and I can code this. Maybe I'll need to use that, but too, obviously, I still need to use that. But at the end of the day, you're actually coding for something that is not just purely abstract, but something that is connected to the Earth. And the reason why we have not really done that much is because by the time programming took place, we are already very distant from the ground. You know, we are already many layers above, so we only know how to program and code for things that are more abstract, right? So this is like going back to the beginning, going back to the basics, which is a lot harder than we think because we are so used to functioning in the abstraction. And that basically is also the basis of the discipline, right? How disciplines are created and how disciplines are formulated. So this is when I thought if I want to bring in inspiration from poetry, insert that into that project, I thought I was thinking of this poem by Latif Mohidin that I was reading in lockdown, which is actually from his book, Wayang Dalang. I think that was his collection that I found from the library before I cannot access the library. I was just thinking about all the metaphors that he's actually using in here, right? And how for instance, all these metaphors, the story, this is actually a story, even though it's like a bunch of metaphors, but they're a story. How can I use this, right, to actually design, I mean, first to design that project and then to kind of design the theory around it. How can I build a hypothesis? There's a lot of noise in the background.
Andy, please mute your mic, please.
Thank you. So anyway, I'm kind of reaching to the end here already. So what I have here is basically a bunch of questions for all of you, right? Think about, because poem is also an abstraction. It's as abstract as coding, you know, as a programming language, right? It's just a different form of abstraction, right? So if I bring this, let's say, into the project, and then I started if I inject the poem into the project, how is that even going to look like? I have no idea yet. I mean, I can imagine how it will look like in my mind, you know, how the poem probably is itself like data from the human, right? Human's perspective of the world injected to data produced by the, you know, the ambience, by what is present around it, and kind of like mixing that together. And then thinking about kind of questions I can actually ask from this. And these are the questions that I'm actually putting before you, right? And using this question as a starting space, starting site as well, to think about philosophy. Instead of saying, okay, this is what philosophy is, maybe let's go and ask questions that probably can give you an inkling into what philosophy is about, right? And just sharing the slides that I actually show my students, because I taught a class on philosophy this semester, right? What actually is philosophy? I mean, how different is this from this, from this, from this, and from this, right? Because this part is all building, right? We went from the abstract, we try to go beyond the abstract, but at the same time, we are still bringing the abstract onto the ground, which is very difficult to do because we are so used to think something's abstract or is tangible. It's hard for us to try to think abstract and tangible together, you know, and try to create something that is visible with that. And then this one itself, instead, represent that abstraction and tangibility at the same time, is present in the poem simultaneously. And then here, I'm trying to see, okay, I do all that, I want to build a hypothesis, right? Maybe my hypothesis will start with what will happen if I connect that poem to that project. And then I start asking all these other questions along those lines. And then I ask myself, what exactly is philosophy, right? It's kind of like taking a step back. As you can see, my presentation is a lot of back and forth. And that basically is also some of the difficulties in presenting art science work, because they are never operating in a linear form. To do it linearly is also a disservice to it, right? But if I want to talk about philosophy in an academic way, then it will actually be a lot more linear. The story will be a lot easier because it'll be kind of like a logical flow of things, right? So there's observation, there is packaging of observations, right? There's some form of generalization going on previously, but I didn't make that explicit. Why? Because I want you to be able to feel the story, going back to intuition and feeling all over again. That's what I wanted you all to kind of experience, right? But philosophy abstractly, that will not be something that you experience. Or be like, you know, philosophy is a science, which is basically the way philosophy used to be defined. And then of course, when you say philosophy is science, then you have to ask, what is science, right? Are we talking about science in the disciplines of science that we are very used to? You know, you have to define that. Or we're talking about science in terms of the organization of knowledge in a more general way. Are we talking about science in the sense that there are parameters of legitimacy, means it has to look like this, that is legitimate. Doesn't look like this, sorry, this is pseudoscience, this is not real, right? And this is probably something as artists you may experience, that you may have your own way of interpreting the science, and people will tell you this is not science, this is pseudoscience, right? Because for them, science only works if it looks like this and we can do this thing. Whereas, how can your art how can your art that you claim is trying to represent science or repackage science, what utility does it have? So it goes back as well to the idea of utility, right? That science is something that has utility, which is something that we have been schooled to think through our education career. So finally, as the zombies would say, they have no internal first experience to go along with, no consciousness, right? So basically, they just care about the world where they can eat their brains in peace, right? And this basically maybe the kind of world that we have actually been taught to be, just shut up and calculate, or just do your art, don't ask all these difficult questions, don't ask how this thing connects to that. Your art looks pretty, or your art, oh yeah, get inspired, or maybe I can use this to teach science, but don't have to ask any harder questions than just to excite the students that science looks beautiful. I mean, that's basically how I think a lot of programs trying to bring arts and science together tend to operate along. So that's all I have to say. Any questions? Oh yeah, this is actually the link to my talk. I know it's not very easy. I couldn't find a better way to kind of link it, but I think if you were to, maybe I should give you the title. So I'll just show you how this thing. Oops. Okay. So you know where to find it by the title. So this is actually a Google Meet thing, so it's a bit strange looking. It's not an edited video, so I just someone record. Sorry. Yes. So you can. So just look up this. If you are interested, you can look up Shapes of Knowledge, Speculative Fiction through Artscience. This is actually a more theoretical discussion. You also hear reference to the Putri Gunung Ledang, but I talk a lot about other things as well that inspire the work from a theoretical perspective. So that's not so much of what you were doing just now. So you can look that up as well. So yeah, if any question, you can email me. And if you want to check out the book, I would say if you don't know whether you want to buy the book, you want to look at the physical book, they are actually available. I know in MPH has a lot of copies of them from what I heard from my publisher. But unfortunately, I think bookstores are closed, so I can't even ask you to go and just browse through. If you're in Penang, I think maybe Gerak Budaya Penang may have it. Actually, I have no idea, but I think Popular and MPH Penang will definitely have it for a certain. And I also kept a copy, well, not a copy, but a preview of my book actually on my academia site. So you can go and look at it if you want to know how the prologue looks like. I know for copyright reasons, obviously, I can't dump the whole book up there. Also because the copyright is not just me, so my publisher. So,
Okay, can we allow people to ask questions?
Yeah. Sorry,
I think we have to give some time for people to ask questions, or they have anything to add. I think this is a very, very interesting presentation. Yeah, I am lost. Apa ni? I tidak boleh berkata apa-apa sebab it's so overwhelming and very, very overwhelming, and it can go anywhere. It's very non-linear, as you just said again. Very organic at the same time. So I have many questions, of course, but I don't want this to be about me and you. I want to open this to everyone. We still have about 178 people. We used to, before this, 184, and still 178, 77. We still have people. If they have anything to add, anything to, any question, anything that they want to ask. Mind blowing.
Maybe I should open this.
Explore this further in workshop mode. Yeah, I tend to agree. There are few quite written responses.
Yeah, I'm trying to open. Okay, I should unshare my screen. Should I unshare my screen because I cannot seem to see anyone while I am screen sharing, I think.
Again, Dr. Chong here.
Dr. Chong, yeah, go on.
Yeah. Can I say a few words? Can I make my comment? Okay. Okay. Actually, what you have done, KUliah is wonderful because you try to integrate not only human but art, science all together in one. But I feel that there's one thing which is missing. Of course, this one some people are aware, but they are not aware that the research in the scientific field on this subject has come to such an advanced level. Previously, in the research field, you don't hear the word consciousness, awareness, Previously, you don't hear. But now, this field, the Professor Maya and I have discussed many times, is partly related to quantum mechanics, entanglement, non-linear process.
Dr. Chong, just to maybe I'm jumping here. There are many things that Clarissa can share, and from many different angles. I'm answering on her behalf actually because I read her book. Because if she answered this, it might be like she's bragging about her book. So let me answer it for her, so that she doesn't look like she's bragging about her book. In her book, which is a very simple, non-threatening looking book, she mentions a lot about quantum mechanics. I even criticized her for her long-winded words in explaining the basics of quantum mechanics. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to make even a quantum physics students to understand quantum mechanics. Not to mention people like me, people from the arts. But she did mention about it. She did mention in the book about consciousness. But that would be a very theoretical presentation. And she has done a theoretical presentation before. I refer to that. It can be very theoretical. I think it can be very theoretical, very philosophical also, because because we are talking about paradigm. So go on, Dr. Chong.
So I'm very impressed, Professor Bajia. You mentioned that Clarissa included this. So basically, as I follow more and more, is this thing on conscious? It's not only on quantum mechanics, Professor Bajia, it's consciousness. So basically now, previously people don't dare to talk because you are talking something which cannot be done experimentally by science. But now consciousness is coming in. Another term for it is awareness. So basically, they say that now there's convergence between consciousness, awareness, and science, right? So please pay attention to this thing called consciousness, awareness, quantum mechanics, because it will change our whole paradigm forever, right? For example, we have heard many years ago. I'm not a spiritual guy, I'm a physicist, but we say that the mind is the most powerful thing in the universe, Like not only the mind, it's consciousness. So actually, if you are in tune to that level of consciousness, according to science, now, convergence, your mind with your consciousness, it can destroy the earth, it can destroy the solar system. So now, a lot of work has come. I'm not saying that we straight away must accept it. You must pay attention to this. So now, do you know that quantum computers are the rage all over the world? In China, they have set up an institute. How many billion dollars with few thousand scientists on quantum application on quantum science. So once they have quantum science to the mass scale, the whole world will change. Take for example, a few years ago, they have set up in China the quantum satellite, where they communicate many hundred kilometers from one part of the world. So the internet we have now is called the classical internet, using classical transistor. Now in future you have quantum transistor. The whole world, the internet of the future, maybe in 5-10 years from now, using quantum transistor, quantum computing, totally different. So we have to be careful. But what I'm worried is that quantum computing is non-linear because of the entanglement idea. It's very powerful. So we hope that it will be put to good use, not for the bad use.
Clarissa, silakan. Response.
I was just saying that quantum consciousness is actually one of, because there's like a different kind of interpretation of quantum mechanics beyond the so-called classical Copenhagen thing, which I don't even like to bring up because there's a lot of debate even just on what the hell is the Copenhagen interpretation. Is no such thing as that. But there's also one guy whose name escaped me now, but I used to read him a lot. Because I actually wrote another paper, if you want to read, which it's not really quantum computing, but it's actually talking about science fiction should I drop the link below?
It's
actually talking about, I had to open my academia to that because I don't remember it.
David Bohm?
Okay, let me find my academia. So I'll just briefly explain what my paper is. This paper, actually, I was reading a lot of stuff on quantum interpretation, because even though the paper, in the end, I took out everything to do with quantum interpretation, because I submitted it to a philosophy / foundations of science journal, and obviously there's a lot of debate. I mean, it's a very difficult paper to begin with in terms of what it's trying to talk about, and a lot of people both agree and disagree with it, which is cool, because I like the fact that people have feelings about my paper and not just ignore it, whether it's positive or negative. But but in there is actually looking at how particle physics is represented in certain selected work of science fiction written mostly by physicists themselves across a different period of time. And I was also thinking about how I was actually digging into all the different physics history around the particle physics development, which also included works on quantum physics and quantum consciousness, because that came out a little bit in some of the the science fiction works that I was looking at. And in this paper, actually, I was trying to suggest the idea that science fiction itself is not just there for you to brainstorm, because it's actually what sometimes scientists use science fiction for, but actually has an even more extended contribution to science, where it becomes a platform for creation, invention as well. And I was trying to show how there were bits of that happening in the science fiction works, even though it never really went very far, because as I said, the people who stories were basically just using it for their creative brainstorming in ways that they cannot play around so much if they're in the lab, because to do that in the lab is going to cost the lab a lot of money. So they do it on paper, on the works of science fiction. So I was showing the different works of discovery that can actually happen when we actually go outside the constraints and the strictures of the so-called scientific method, which has been shown to be even problematic. That's the idea that there's one method. In reality, there's no such thing as a single scientific method. It's just something that we thought there is.
Can you read the question by Rupesh Sitaran in the chat?
Which one?
Question in the chat by Rupesh Sitaran from.
Oh, Rupesh. Okay.
From Multimedia.
I'm trying to see, because there's a lot of Rupesh. Oh, Rupesh RS. Okay. I wonder, how do we decentralize the position of the human within the framework of Anthropocene? I'm assuming the various act of abstraction is something that is very human, as it serves the purpose for human understanding. In that sense, it also includes the concept of art science. Yeah, there's actually a lot of work that talks about transhumanism. In fact, I decided that instead of, I decided to do a bit of reading about what other people were doing while preparing for this talk, because it's always something that I do a lot in any creative process. I look at other people for inspiration. I'm actually reading a paper sent to me by a friend, colleague of mine, who is now somewhere in Cambodia, I think, who is also reviewing my book. Actually, he wrote a really wonderful paper on Anthropocene that I just started reading, but I'm really quite interested in it. That I had to come for this meeting, so I couldn't finish reading it. So, and Anthropocene, actually, there's a lot of discourse around it that also tries to decenter the human as the foundation of everything to do with justice, because it's because of this overcentrism on human that we actually reach the point of disaster that we have today, right? This the whole humanism centricism of started from the Renaissance, they went on to the Enlightenment, which the Romantic period scholars and creatives try to push against, but not very successfully, because by the 19th century, we went back to the humans again, which led to the whole industrialization process, led to colonization, led to extraction, right? And even disciplines, as we know, is also very much human-centric, because humans like to discipline everything, right? Everything that they have control over, they want to exert control over. So there's a discourse in Anthropocene, and I think Bruno Latour, which is another thinker that I don't want to go into because he sometimes gets into very crazy ideas, but he actually is very interested in thinking about the Anthropocene without the human, also thinking about the climate in the terms of climate. But as I mentioned earlier just now, the problem is that vocabulary. What kind of vocabulary can we bring in when the vocabulary that we have been using is very human-centric? So how can we push against that human-centric vocabulary, right? And art science itself, I have to say, historically, it also comes from a very human-centric position. There are attempts to move outside of it. I think transhumanism tried to do that, right? But when you have anything attached to the word human, it still comes back to the human at the end. The vocabulary still comes from the human.
Okay, sorry, Galeri, you have many questions here. You have to answer very short and
all
concise.
the other questions
There's
as
another
well.
one from Kabir Roslan. Can situational based art be discourse from speculative design or design experience?
I just want to clarify, situational based art means, is it an art that is like critical design art, right? You're responding to an issue, right? Is that situational based art?
I don't know. We have to do it in another lecture on situational art.
Oh, if that's what is then, yeah.
Situational art is like this. Something happens, some situation takes place, and we call it art. I have issue with situational art, but anyway, yeah, that's what I understand by situational art. So what I'm asking is whether we can discuss it from the perspective of speculative design.
Yeah, there's an area called adversarial design, which I think probably falls more closely with situational based art, because adversarial means it's actually reacting against something by doing something opposite. The other question on property of representation, language of framing, how code visual being established. That's not another. Is that a question? Or how can we apply this to make everyone a better human being? I think that's also the question that I'm trying to do as well with my plastic and soil project. Actually, there's one thing I want to do once things normalize a little bit, is to actually go and talk to scientists who work with earth, work on the earth, work with soil as well. Yeah, actor network theory, but actor network theory is an old part of Latour. He actually, I think, has gone beyond that. He's now doing some stuff related to Anthropocene. In fact, the person who's reviewing my book is actually reviewing Latour's latest work, Critical Zones, as well as Arturo Escobar's work on, what was the title? World Building. I was actually looking at it because I was so intrigued by that book. Let me see if I can find it. I hope I can find it, because I opened too many tabs. I probably can't find. But Arturo Escobar has the latest book. Arturo Escobar, for those who do not know, is actually one of the big theories on that push against, the very neo-imperialist perspective of developmentalism that actually haunts Malaysia as well, because Malaysia also has a very neo-imperialist approach to development. So Escobar is a Latin American philosopher who pushes against that, and he actually wrote a recent book that just came out, I think, from Duke University Press, which actually is on world building, where he actually talks about world building in the same sense that I did. And the critical zones thing actually expounds kind of like what Latour is thinking of these days, starting, I think, more than 5 or 6 years ago, where he's actually talking about the earth, where he's trying to remove any discussion on humans from it. There's also what object-oriented philosophy tried to do, but also for me failed, because I even asked one of the pioneers of it, like, how do you decenter the human for your object orientation? Because you're still pretty much you're still integrating the human into it, and I never got a good response to that. And this was like probably a decade ago when I was still a student. So there's the older Latour of actor network theory. I'm sure it's still present in his latest work, but the last talk I heard him give in Singapore, he wasn't that keen on actor network theory anymore. I don't know about this book. I tried to see if I could find a copy of it. So far, I guess I'll have to buy it because I have no access to an ebook version.
Okay, all right. Can I summarize? Because sorry,
sure.
Yeah. So we still have 165 people. So it is quite an achievement also in terms of quantitatively lah kan. Anyway, all right. So first of all, thank you very much, Clarissa, for this very, very interesting and engaging, thought-provoking presentation. I know it's a very difficult subject to cover, and for example, we are talking about non-linearity, but we have to present our presentation in a very linear platform. Probably that would be another example of the kind of paradox. Anyway, let me summarize. You shared about your own background, your educational background. You also mentioned about your interest in narratives, in storytelling, in oral storytelling, which I found personally very, very interesting. You also mentioned about how the existing educational system, perhaps especially in Malaysia, as being very rigid and narrow. Maybe you were talking about it from epistemological point of view. You mentioned about your experience with interdisciplinarity within the social sciences when you were studying. Did you study what? What did you study? Literature or something? I forgot. Sorry.
Yeah, I studied literature.
You mentioned about your mentor who introduced you to the whole concept of art science and how you explore and connect with artists and scientists. And also interestingly, you commented about this Ivy League, which for you seem to be a bit traditionalist and interested in maintaining the status quo or disciplinary boundaries. And then you also said something about Brain Science Institute, where people coming from different disciplines coming together to learn, to explore about neuroscience, which I think is interesting because that's also my personal interest. And you also say something here about art making as inclusive of doing, thinking, and theorizing. So it's not just making, but philosophizing. And then you show your model, your quadrant, which I found very interesting. I think it's more like a paradigmatic model. And what else? Your neuroscience professor, you crashed the professor's class. I like the idea of crashing class, but I'm not sure about
So workshop.
crashing class.
Yeah, I crash classes and workshops regularly. So both.
I like that because I went to the United States to do my bachelor's and master's. I crashed classes also. Then the word art science has been proprietized. What else? The interpretation of art science and what is art science and what is not art science, art inspired science or science inspired art, something like that. And also very important, I think, if I can reiterate this thing called infrastructure that can create creating a space that can be a magnet that draw people from different disciplines and create a space where the model that you show can be sort of implemented. So we do, and you also mentioned about Malaysia doesn't have that kind of space. You know, like if you want to draw bees, you need to create that funding. You know? So we don't have this what we call as privileged infrastructure. Right? And you also mentioned about mediation. I think those who are interested about mediation can read your book a lot. You explain a lot about mediation, history of science, quantum biology, very interesting. A mathematician, we mentioned about it just before this, Alfred Whitehead and Russell, Tesla, and then of course, what do you call it? Anthropocene. And we relate that to nature as our guru, as a creative source, going back to Tanah or Earth, giving back value instead of just extracting, which I think is very pertinent now with the current situation, not only in Malaysia, but probably specifically in Malaysia. We can use some of the examples of how we have been destroying our natural environment and how that is embedded in our own warisan and tradition, for example, in the indigenous knowledge. You mentioned about research creation, which is non-linear. I have a lot of questions in that regard, but that will make our discussion become too theoretical, and many of our participants may not be able to follow it. All right. Then we have Dr. Chong here. Dr. Chong mentioned about quantum mechanics, about consciousness, about awareness, about, I think also about mindfulness, about state of being. That will bring us back to many different forms of tradition. And when Anderson E asked a question about how all these interesting theoretical explorations can contribute to us being a good human being, I think that is extremely pertinent. That I hope all of us would a question, I would say. That's it. I think we've already 4:13. It has been a very interesting presentation. I wish we could talk even more. Maybe in the future we can do some more. Not necessarily online. I think what most of the exercises that you have shared in your book is very applicable and can be applied and can be we call it practice offline. Would be interesting to do it offline. So that's it. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Yes, thank you everybody for putting up with me for 2 hours.
Wonderful, very very nice. We have few more people that we are planning to call to join to share, including Dr. Chung. Though Dr. Chung, if you are still around, you stand by. We will invite you. I did a function called Kenduri Ilmu, where I invited Dr. Chung to present on quantum mechanics and how that can relate to the arts. At my house, I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago. So Dr. Chung, by we might call him to share with us, and then we also have few other people that are.
So, Professor Maya, let me have a word. Actually, I'm very amazed by Professor Lee. Usually, when we attend a scientific presentation, it's only science. Or art, only art. But this is a fusion of everything. So it's very refreshing, I find it. Right?
Thank you.
So I will feel, in a sense, we have a lot of chat before Professor Maya. I agree that, in a sense, the future of man is no more a split personality between art and science, but a fusion of both. That is the way to go. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So that is a very good summary of what we gone through today. Very timely also, because Dr. Chung is our Yoda. Okay. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I end this session. Look forward to the next session. So bye everybody. Terima kasih banyak-banyak. Salam mesra, salam kasih, salam sayang.
Stay safe, everyone.
Stay safe, ya. Stay safe. Stay safe. Terima kasih.
Saya keluar kan? Okay.